All right, here we are for another biology video. And as you can see, this one is going to be, again, about the evidence for evolution. Um, so the evidence for evolution comes from several different scientific disciplines. Biology, of course, because we're learning about biology. Paleontology, which is fossils, which is actually the main topic for this particular video. Of course, there's a lot of evidence from those two disciplines, but there's also evidence from chemistry. This diagram is showing the evolution of different amino acids. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. And so the number here shows the number of steps that it would take to create these different amino acids. And so this one over here is called glutamic acid, and it has this particular structure. And this is the part, of course, that's important, the R group. And then this next one is called glutamine, which is right here on the chart, right? And you might notice that glutamic acid and glutamine are very, very similar. There's two carbons there and two carbons there, with a third carbon with an O, but then there's an O right there, an oxygen, and then there's a nitrogen group right there. There's one difference between those, right? And so it would make sense that you could make glutamine from a glutamic acid. And then if you go further to the right on the chart, you get to one like serine, which looks a lot like glutamine. It's missing one of the carbons, and now we have an OH instead of this group. So there's more steps that are needed, but of course, that's why this one would take 4 steps to create. The next one on the list would be something like this one, cysteine, which is CYS. And you can see that serine and cysteine are very similar in that there's an S there and there's an O there, right? And so when you look at the chemicals, you can see how evolution has kind of worked over time, right? So evidence from chemistry that helps to explain evolution. Geology will be something that we'll have a whole nother video about, right? But we have rock layers, and we can figure out how old the rocks are, and the youngest rocks are on the top and the oldest are at the bottom. So when you find a fossil somewhere, you will know its relative age. Here's another one that kind of just shows the same kind of thing, and that you know that these fossils have to be older than these fossils because they're farther down. Then that leads to, how do you know how old the rocks are? And so there's physics that's involved about half-lives and things. We'll have more information about this as we go along. We have geography. This is a diagram that shows how the continents used to be connected thanks to continental drift. They have drifted apart, but they used to all be connected. And one of the reasons we know they're connected, and the reason why it makes sense how it supports evolution, is that when you find a fossilized fern in parts of Australia and Antarctica and Africa and South America, you would have to ask yourself, well, how can a fern be in all these different places that in today's age are so far apart? It's not like, maybe you could argue that one of these animals could have like swam across the ocean, which still doesn't really happen. But how is a fern going to do that? Well, it can't really do that unless everything was connected together, right? And so this goes to supporting the idea that the Earth is very old, and that there's been plenty of time for all these changes to occur. And so geography and earth science play a part in supporting the evolution. And then, of course, there's math that you would learn more in AP biology, but there is math that goes along with evolution. And so there's lots of different sources of evidence, right? But our main source of evidence for the longest time has been fossils. And I talked a little bit about this slide already, but we have all kinds of different fossils, actual bones. We have trapped species in amber. We have just imprints of different things that don't actually leave good fossils, but they've left imprints. We have all these different rocks, basically, that tell us about the past, right? And so as we did in that Kaminal-Kuhl assignment, we take the fossils and we just put them in order from oldest to newest, and then we look to see how they're connected to the ones that came before them. And this is how we get evolutionary histories, like how we understand how the horse evolved, or any of the other species that we know about, because we have tons of fossils, as you might remember from the other activity with the big spreadsheet that showed you all those different fossils that we have, right? But one of the things that comes up all the time when you're doing the communal activity or when scientists are doing this in real life is that the fossils are not complete. So sometimes there's these gaps where you're not really sure how they would fit together because there's probably something missing, and it would be, hopefully we'll find them. And we're always improving what we know by finding more and more fossils. And so the more fossils we find, the better our stories and our explanations are. And so one really cool example of this goes back to something else that we were already talking about, which would be whales, right? Whales fossils were not very abundant in before about the 1970s. People really just didn't know that much about whales, and they didn't have that many fossils of them. But it does present some sort of problem when you're trying to make one of these evolutionary histories, when you're trying to figure out where the whale came from, and you can't put it with the fish because it's not a fish, it's clearly a mammal, so it's got to go with the mammals. So where does it go? And I've already kind of spoiled this a little bit throughout other videos, but at some point somebody said, well, I think it goes with the cows and the camels. And so this is obviously a very outlandish idea at some level, right? Like, you're telling me that a whale is similar to a camel, right? And so begrudgingly, you got to put the whale somewhere on the cladogram. So they put it over here near the camel, but still there's a lot of doubt about this kind of thing. But then more and more fossils start to be found, right? And so here's the types of the organisms, the earliest ancestor of the whale back here that looks kind of like this little dog thing. And then there's the slow progression towards whale or dolphin, right? And again, people are like, well, how could this possibly be? But we have fossils for all of these different animals, right? And so you can see again the gradualism here, where you have one organism that looks very similar to the next. This guy has a little bit bigger head. Its legs are a little bit different in the back, giving it more able to like spring out. They think that this particular species hung out in the water, like kind of like a crocodile. It looks something maybe like this, possibly like this. I think this is a little bit over dramatic, making it look, maybe it was this scary. It's hard to say what they actually look like from just the skeleton, but this is one fossil. We have this fossil of this thing right here, right? Like people have found these bones. And so you can see again, the slow progression where the back legs are getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until they're just gone, right? And as that's happening, the front legs are becoming more like flippers, more like flippers, more like flippers, until they're flippers, right? And so again, this is gradualism, and this is people went out and found these things called transitional fossils. We thought that they had to exist, and then people went out and they found fossils that look just like these pictures to show that this is actually what could have happened, right? And so thanks to finding all these fossils, and actually thanks to some more other evidence about like DNA that we'll talk about in a totally different video, we now know that whales actually do in fact go over here with the hippos, the common ancestor of a whale. It's actually this one right here, Pakicetus. This is the common ancestor of whales and hippos, right? So one group breaks off to become hippos, the other group breaks off to become the Ambulocetus, which then becomes that one, which becomes that one, and eventually becomes the whales, right? So again, it's something where you're like, well, really, like the whales and the hippos go together? But this is what the evidence shows. It goes against the common logic, but again, this is what science is all about, is trying to verify what we think is happening, right? So that's one really good example of how fossils have changed our understanding of the past, and how we're constantly revising our ideas as we find more evidence. Now, there's a couple other places where there's some really interesting transitional fossils that fill the gaps between major steps in evolution. And there's two of them that I wanted to talk about. One of them is from fish to amphibians, and then the other one from dinosaurs to birds. Here is a cladogram, a evolutionary history that shows all of these vertebrates, right? So these are things that have backbones. And sharks were the first animals that you would recognize as actual fish, but sharks don't have true bones. They have cartilage skeleton, right? And so then we have these things called the ray-finned fish, and they have a bony skeleton, just like all the rest of these guys do. But the big thing, of course, here is that the next big leap in evolution was to go from having a skeleton to having 4 actual limbs, right? Everything up here has 4 limbs of some kind. And so there has to be something that's halfway between those, right? Like there's got to be something that is part fish and also part land animal, right? And so for a long time, right, this would be a hang up in people's understanding that it makes sense that the fish came first because their fossils are oldest, and the amphibians came second because their fossils are the second oldest. But when you tell people that fish walked onto the land, this sounds kind of crazy. But then we keep searching for fossils, and we keep searching for evidence, and eventually we find things. And so where are we at here? First, I want this example that I'm about to talk about the fish really is a great example of the predictive power of science, and in particular of scientific theories, right? In one of the other videos, I made a big point of how science is still a theory, not a fact. And the theory of evolution is not verifiable because you can't go back in time. But it is highly supported by all this evidence. And so we would be able to use the theory to predict things. And so again, why do I have astronomy stuff on the screen? Because there's an example of astronomy where a theory was used to predict something that then was verified later on. And so people have known about planets for quite a long time. Planets like Mercury and Venus and Mars and Jupiter and Saturn even, I think, I'm pretty sure. These are things that you can see without a telescope. They just look like stars for the most part, but they look much bigger and brighter, and they move differently than the other stars do. So people have known about those planets for a long time. Once Galileo invented the telescope, people were able to find bigger planets that you can't really see very well without a telescope, right? But after people discovered Uranus, and yes, that's how you say that one, they started to notice something that was weird, that Uranus, it wasn't where it was always supposed to be, right? A lot of this has to do with math, about Isaac Newton and inventing calculus and things to figure out the orbits of the planets, but Uranus didn't fit the math sometimes. And so this was a problem, enough of a problem that people started to doubt the math. They started to even doubt like gravity. They're like, well, wait a second, maybe gravity doesn't work the way that we think it works, way out far away from the sun. And so that's why our math is wrong. But then somebody else said, well, maybe that's true, but I have a different idea. I think that there's something else really big out there, something big that's pulling Uranus in the wrong direction. So that's why it's not where it's supposed to be, right? And so using this, they then do a bunch of math, and they say, okay, well, based on the orbit and where Uranus is moving right now, we think that the big mass, this unknown thing, is right here. And sure enough, they take their big, now much more powerful telescopes, and they point it in the spot where the math predicted, and they found the planet Neptune, right? Like you can't really find it. Like think about how big space is, and if you were to try to get a telescope and just scan space for every planet, like that's impossible. You have to know what you're looking for. So they said, point your telescope here, and there was something there. The math predicted that, right? So the theory that they had about gravity was upheld. And before I move on, yes, gravity still is a theory. Nobody knows exactly how gravity works. We have a lot of evidence to show that it is what we think it is, but nobody can prove that gravity works, how gravity works, which is an interesting idea. Now, back to the sciencey part here, the biology part, the evolution part. We know that bony fish evolved around 419 million years ago, right? So they're really old. And then amphibians evolved later on, which is 370 million years ago, right? So there's like a 50 million year gap right there. There should be some sort of fossil in between those times where there's something that's kind of a fish and kind of an amphibian. And so first thing they had to ask themselves is, where do you find rocks like that? Where are we going to get rocks that are that old? And so here's where, again, I also like the story because it's about how people work together. The biologists had to go find a geologist who would show them and tell them where they could find rocks that are between these ages. And the scientists said, look here on this place called Ellesmere Island, right, in northern Canada. Now, this would be a weird place to find the ancestor of amphibians, considering there are 0 amphibians in Ellesmere Island right now because it's way, way too cold, right? But thanks to some of that other evidence that we have, 400 million years ago, that land was way closer to the equator, meaning that it was much warmer. And it has since, in the 400 million years since, has moved upwards, which again is something that has been confirmed from other disciplines of science. So they went to this island and they started to look for rocks that would be about the age that they wanted them to be. And they found this. It took a lot of digging, right? Like you can't just go out and like imagine just going out to like the hill next to your house and just saying, I'm going to go dig and find a very particular thing, right? Like this is hard to do. So teams of people went out for years and they found this fossil that you see on the screen, right? They nicknamed it Tiktaalik. And this is kind of an artist's representation of what it might have looked like. It looks a little goofy because again, it's hard to know exactly what its like skin would have looked like, but we know what its bones looked like. Now, why is this one important? It's of the right age, between the 419 and 370 million years ago mark. And it has fish traits and land animal traits. In particular, it has a wrist bones, right? Like fish, other fish, the salmon that maybe you're going to eat for dinner doesn't have a radius and an ulna and an ulnar and all these other different types of bones inside there, right? Like it has a flipper, it has a fin. This is something that only amphibians would be the first things to officially have those kinds of things. It has a shoulder and an elbow, right? Like how many fish have you seen before that have an elbow? I'm pretty sure it's 0. But I have never seen all the animals on the planet. Maybe there is a fish out there with an elbow. One of the most important parts actually doesn't even come from its ability to walk on land, but it has a special part of its neck that allows it to move its head differently. So here again is like a representation of what it might look like compared to the actual fossil. And here's a kind of a timeline to show here's where Tiktaalik is. It wasn't the first, this was its ancestors before it. They were completely in the water, and then the descendants afterwards are on land. And so here's what I was talking about, the neck. The blue parts down here represent bones that are only in fish. And if you think about it, a fish, it doesn't have a neck. Its head is fused to its body. So if a fish wanted to turn its head, it couldn't turn its head. It has to turn its whole body because it doesn't have a neck. But Tiktaalik is missing those bones, right? Like Tiktaalik wouldn't be able to actually move its head around. And why would that be important? Because that would allow it to stick its head up, like here's like the water level, and it would be able to stick its head up out of the water and like eat stuff, right? Or move around, right? So this gives it an advantage that something that has a head or head that's fused to its shoulders, that wouldn't be able to move its head around, right? So Tiktaalik is a great example of the predictive power of a theory. And we now have this story of the gradual change from completely aquatic to terrestrial, which means on land, right? And this would be the beginnings of amphibians right about there. Amphibians eventually lead to reptiles, and then reptiles actually lead to birds and mammals. The ancestor of mammals is one of the ancestors of dinosaurs, basically. We don't have time for that story, at least not in this video, but we do have time to talk about this one. This is a fossil called an Archaeopteryx, and it was found, as you can see, it was alive, as you can see, 150 million years ago. Now, this is a cool fossil just in general because it has bones, but it also has these imprints from where it had wings, right? And so this is interesting. It has dinosaur traits. It has dinosaur legs. It has a dinosaur neck. but it clearly has feathers. And that's pretty neat, right? And so here's a artist recreation of what it might have looked like, a feathered dinosaur. We now know that a lot of dinosaurs, including the T-Rex, had feathers. So even though it looks pretty neat, Jurassic Park probably isn't as accurate as it could have been. Of course, we didn't know that at the time. But this supports the idea that dinosaurs transitioned to birds, because this is kind of like a half dinosaur, half bird. Now, the thing that makes this one even more unique and special is that its head wasn't completely like smashed. And so they were able to put it under like an MRI kind of machine and to image the inside of its skull, right? So a computer analysis of the skull. And so here's a modern bird has basically the gray part here is just like the empty spot where its brain is supposed to go. And the interesting thing here is that the brain, the space where the brain goes in the skull is the same shape as its brain, right? So if you can see the inside the Archaeopteryx's skull, you can actually figure out what the shape of the Archaeopteryx's brain was, right? And so on a modern bird, there's this bump back here. Humans and other mammals, we don't have that bump on our brains because this bump for the bird is specialized to help it fly, in particular for its visual ability while it's flying. You see here, vision, balance, and flight coordination, right? When you're a bird and you're flying super freaking fast and you have to turn at the last second, right? Like you've probably been in the car and saw a bird that was about to hit you and then it just swerves off, right? How can they do that? Because they have a specialized part of their brain that allows them to have quick reflexes and to help them make those sharp turns. Now, the important part here is that the Archaeopteryx has the same spot there, right? The skull, the MRI of the skull shows that there's a spot for this bump. Now, it doesn't prove that the Archaeopteryx could fly, but it does show that the Archaeopteryx had a brain that was similar to the brain of a bird that can fly, right? So this is what we're talking about with the whole theory of evolution thing, right? There's all this evidence that points in a certain direction, and unfortunately, we'll never go back in time to verify that the Archaeopteryx could have flown, but it certainly seems like it could have. And then, of course, we'll talk, there's more evidence as we go along. Well, we can see how modern birds compare to some of the dinosaur evidence that we have, right? To further prove that dinosaurs and birds are related. In any case, this is just a few examples, not just one, a few examples of how fossils are used to understand evolution and to support the theory of evolution.